The final way in which sodium is absorbed is, well, it's in the colon, and it's absorbed via sodium channels stimulated by aldosterone, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So if you put aldosterone to aside for a second, well, similarly to the previous mechanisms, the sodium-potassium ATPase creates the sodium gradient from the lumen to the enterocyte and into the basolateral domain into the body. The sodium enters as a result of this gradient via ENaC sodium channels in the colon. So very important to remember that ENaC sodium channels, they're in the colon. And it's this whole thing is highly efficient sodium absorption because it occurs even against a concentration gradient because of the sodium-potassium ATPase creating the gradient. And I mentioned that aldosterone stimulates the entry of sodium, the absorption of sodium in the colon. How does it do this? Well, aldosterone stimulates three different things. It causes more ENaC channels to open. It causes more sodium channels, ENaC channels, to be inserted. And it also causes more channels, ENaC channels, and sodium-potassium pumps to be made. So if you've got more pumps being made, it's going to have a greater gradient. If there's a greater gradient, there's going to be a more rapid absorption of sodium through the ENaC channels, of which there are more being inserted, more being made, and more being opened as a result of aldosterone. So these three things, they result in increased sodium absorption. So now moving on to chloride absorption. Well, chloride transport occurs throughout the small and large bowel and is very closely linked to the sodium absorption because of the three routes of chloride absorption. It's either passive, through parallel sodium-hydrogen and chloride bicarbonate exchange, just like the way that sodium is absorbed, and by chloride bicarbonate exchange. So this one's electroneutral because of the bicarbonate and proton being pumped out at the same time, and this one's not electroneutral. This is chloride bicarbonate exchange. So first of all, passively. Well, chloride is passively absorbed throughout the intestines, driven by energy from sodium-glucose channels and ENaC channels. So if you remember, sodium-glucose channels, that's the first mechanism by which sodium is co-transported and absorbed into the body. And ENaC channels, these are sodium channels in the colon, which allow the entry of sodium into the body. So let's have a look at that. So in the small intestine, sodium and glucose are absorbed through co-transporters, which provides energy. And the colon has epithelial sodium channels called ENaC channels, which also provide energy. And this creates an electrochemical gradient, which causes chloride to enter the body. And as I mentioned previously, it's absorbed through two routes, either transcellularly through the enterocytes, through the apical membrane and the basolateral membrane, or paracellularly, so that's between the enterocytes via the tight junctions into the body. And this whole thing results in passive chloride absorption. That was in the throughout the bowel. In the ileum and colon, chloride is absorbed via parallel sodium-hydrogen and chloride bicarbonate exchange. So if you remember, the sodium is absorbed in, protons pumped out, and the chloride comes in, bicarbonate pumped out. Where did the proton and bicarbonate come from? They come from the reaction of water and carbon dioxide with carbonic anhydrase. So let's have a look at that. So in the ileum and colon, water and carbon dioxide react via carbonic anhydrase, making hydrogen, which goes out through the sodium-hydrogen exchanger, and bicarbonate, which is pumped out through the chloride bicarbonate exchanger. The overall result of which is the absorption of sodium chloride and the secretion of hydrogen and bicarbonate. Therefore, it's electroneutral. And this happens in the fasted state. The chloride bicarbonate exchanger can be affected by congenital chloroduria, which I'll come on to in a second. And just like the sodium absorption, this is inhibited by three things: CAMP, CGMP, and calcium. Where can the CAMP come from? Well, it comes from Werner-Morrison syndrome, which I'm going to mention in a minute, and enterotoxins such as cholera. And if you have cholera and you have an increased CAMP, you're not going to be able to absorb the sodium chloride, so water is going to leave, it's going to stay in your in the gut, causing diarrhea. And the final method of chloride absorption, it's via the chloride bicarbonate exchanger only, without the parallel sodium-hydrogen exchange. And chloride is absorbed without the parallel sodium-hydrogen exchange, as I mentioned. And this is in the ileum and in the large bowel, in the surface epithelial cells of the large bowel. So the ileum and large bowel, the carbon dioxide and water react, making proton and bicarbonate. The bicarbonate leaves through the chloride bicarbonate exchanger, and chloride absorption occurs into the body without the parallel sodium hydrogen exchange. So now let's ask, well, this hydrogen that's produced, where does it go if it's not secreted? Well, it's absorbed back into the body via a sodium hydrogen exchanger. So rather than the hydrogen being pumped out through into the lumen, it goes back into the body. So this chloride bicarbonate exchanger that I keep talking about, that allows the absorption of chloride and secretion of bicarbonate, it can be affected. You can have an absence of this exchanger if you have congenital chloroduria. So what is it? Well, it's an autosomal recessive condition which will give you congenital chloroduria, and this will be an absence of the chloride bicarbonate exchanger. So what will this result in? Well, less bicarbonate will be secreted, so therefore you'll have an increase in plasma bicarbonate, because if you're secreting less, you're going to have more in your body, more in your blood, so an increase in plasma bicarbonate, making you alkalytic, right? And if you have an absence of the exchanger, you also can have a less chloride absorption. If you have less chloride absorption, it's going to result in high stool chloride. So, chloroduria makes you secrete less bicarbonate and absorb less chloride. How can you treat this bicarbonate buildup in your body? Well, if you remember back to the secretion of acid from parietal cells in the stomach, the production of protons also produces bicarbonate. And the bicarbonate enters the blood, creating an alkaline tide, right? So you can reduce this alkaline tide in your body by reducing the acid secretion. How are you going to reduce the acid secretion? Well, by using proton pump inhibitors such as omeprazole. So the proton pump inhibitor will prevent the acid secretion and therefore reduce the bicarbonate going from the parietal cells of the stomach into the blood, therefore reducing the alkaline tide, treating your alkalytic state, which you've had as a result of congenital chloroduria, absence of the chloride bicarbonate exchanger. So you can treat it with PPIs.